I was acutely aware that it doesn't mean shit to chase your passion if you're not able to buy your baby diapers. Between the birth of my child, 120 days of gymming, and a full-time job, I can tell that I've definitely made the transition to adulthood. So I figured I would take a minute to reflect on the top 3 lessons that got me here. Lesson 1. The default path is not your only option. My conventional idea of success was to climb the corporate ladder at my first job and very rapidly work my way up until I eventually earned enough money that I could buy a house and settle down. This was honest to God my goal when I started my working life back in 2019. And within the space of 1 year, I very quickly climbed the ranks, eventually becoming responsible for the largest acquisition channel in the first company I worked for. And I remember it like it was yesterday when they told me after an intense year of work that my efforts would be rewarded by an increase in pay, salary, and more responsibility in a role that at the time when I started was constantly working towards. And you might expect that I would be over the moon by getting this responsibility and getting the pay rise. But in reality, what happened was I felt absolutely no different, not even slightly. And this made me feel insanely confused. Because if I was working for a year tirelessly towards this goal, and then in achieving it, not feeling any different, what made me think that as I would continue to climb the ranks, that would be any different? And as I slowly started to realize that pointlessly climbing the corporate ladder apparently wasn't for me, at that time, logically, all the good jobs were in busy cities, in expensive cities, and therefore it only made sense to stay there until Corona hit. And all of a sudden I was shown a whole new reality, because that was my first introduction to remote work. Now don't worry, this is not going to be some propaganda for you to start working remotely. What the remote work showed me that there was nothing speaking for me staying in this one center location when I could also do the same working from behind my laptop while traveling the world and still have the same amount of income. Because if remote work worked, why would I go back to limiting myself to a fixed location when I could probably live 2 dreams all at once? Maybe even more importantly to that, why would I put myself through the stress of needing to pay off a mortgage month after month when at the time my goals were to travel and see the world? And if you truly want to buy a house, there's nothing I'm saying against that. Great, buy it. But for me, as I said, remote work opened my eyes to the possibility of something other than the default path. A concept I learned from the book by Paul Millard called The Pathless Path. And within this whole shift in thinking, one question that constantly echoed in my mind was, if work consumed your entire life, would life be worth living? And at that moment, I actually already knew the type of life I wanted to build. But it would still take me another 4 years before I eventually got there. And even now, I'm still working on making it bulletproof. Which leads to lesson 2, and probably one of the harshest and most unspoken lessons. You will probably lose a lot of friends, but that's okay. Let me explain. People honestly don't talk about how many friendships you lose after graduation. This realization I felt hit me particularly hard because between the ages of 0 and 18, I had already moved 11 times. So when I eventually was at university for the first time in my life for a period of 4 years, this was my first chance to properly build up friendships over a longer period of time. But as strange as it probably sounds, losing a lot of friends was secretly a blessing in disguise. Now bear with me, because it forced me to figure out how I could build a life that I actually enjoyed, which was not bound to the presence of other people. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have friends or you shouldn't live where your friends are. For me, I realized that after university, the amount of time you spend with your friends will decrease year on year, even if you live in the same city. And again, leading back to point 1, it added to this narrative of why would I stay in a busy, expensive city? What I truly felt I wanted was to travel and to live somewhere where it was normal priced and to live somewhere where I could make new experiences, see new things, meet new people, learn from experts, all the while still coming back with a certain regularity in order to see those same friends and probably seeing them as much as I would have when I would have stayed home. But even if you don't want to travel, that's fine. I still think you should look for a job that fulfills you. And here's why. I once had a conversation with a colleague who told me about how each second weekend he would meet up with his friends from university and reminisce about the good old times. Now keep in mind at the time he was 28 and me being 24 could only look at that story as I'm 28 and my best years are already behind me. Now for me that gave me almost a certain level of panic because I refused to admit that my best days were behind me. So this fueled my desire to continue improving myself, continue learning new things and doing things particularly for myself. If I think about what currently fuels me to build a life I love, it's traveling and content creation. Now, that could look completely different in 10 years' time. Maybe I'll settle down by then. To some extent, I hope I will. But the more important thing is that I refuse to admit that my best days are already behind me and constantly living in the past when there's so much out there in the future. If you're anything like me, entrepreneurship and being a creator has given me the life of freedom that I have so long looked for. But in order to allow me to continue doing that, I have to keep my paperwork in order, meaning that invoices have to be sent, my taxes have to be done, all receipts should be saved in the same place. And this was something that frustrated me for years until I found Moneybird. And luckily, they have decided to sponsor the Quarter Life Crisis podcast. So if you're like me and you're looking for one tool where you can send your invoices, send invoice reminders, store all your contacts, store your receipts, figure out how you should do your taxes, and you're a creator or entrepreneur in the Netherlands, then Moneybird is the tool for you. It has saved me so much time and hassle, and I can strongly recommend. So with that, thanks for listening, and let's get back into today's show. But as said, these realizations and lessons have not been smooth sailing. And one of the biggest setbacks to this whole process actually came only 3 months ago, and which will be my final lesson of today's podcast, which is that you should spend some time to figure out what your rich life looks like, and not what your life would be like if you were rich. Let me explain. One of my biggest setbacks occurred about 11 months ago, when my girlfriend and I found out that we were pregnant. Now don't get me wrong, I love my baby to bits. She has become my entire world in just 2 months' time. However, at the time it certainly didn't feel that way. And being in a bit of a problem-solving mode and knowing how expensive children are, I decided to figure out ways I could raise money as quick as possible. And for me that translated into taking another 40-hour job, even though I knew from my first 2 job experiences that I didn't really want to work 40 hours again. And what happened was I defaulted back to my original path in fear that I wouldn't be able to provide for my child. And I think this was probably my first ever real adult dilemma, because I've heard so many times of parents who want to sacrifice everything for their children and say that it was worth it. And that narrative being in the back of my head talked me into taking on a full-time job. But as the months went by and I increasingly became more unsatisfied with the position I was in, it started translating into my relationship. And it wasn't until my partner pointed out that my daughter experiencing me being unhappy and unfulfilled for the majority of her life, but therefore having a lot of financial resources, would in no way have any positive effect on her other than assuming that work will be equal to pain. On top, in the beginning of her life, there's very little that a baby demands financially. So wouldn't it make sense if I have entrepreneurial ambitions to do that right away rather than postponing that to a later stage where the financial responsibility is probably significantly higher? And yet, I don't want to pretend like money's not important. I was still left with an intense dilemma. After all, I was acutely aware that it doesn't mean shit to chase your passion if you're not able to buy your baby diapers. So something that helped me get out of this was hearing Ramit Sethi talk about his concept of figuring out your rich life. And if you want to hear more in depth about this, I recommend listening to his interview with Stephen Bartlett on the Diary of a CEO. But essentially what he says is that most people, including myself, when asked the question, if money wasn't an option, what would you do with your life? Answer something along the lines of, I want to do what I want, when I want. And yet when the follow-up question to that is asked, well, what do you then want? Most people choke, because all of a sudden they have to define what it is that they actually want. And for me, this was actually incredibly difficult. A common example I've seen come by quite a lot is people who talk about how they want to travel full time and just see the world, all the while they just signed a contract for a 30-year mortgage. Those two seem counterintuitive because your actions don't match the things that you're doing. So what I ended up doing to get out of that dilemma is look at my situation and ask myself, what would my rich life look like? And when breaking that down, I realized that meant having the freedom to travel, having the freedom to create content full-time, having the freedom to put food on the table for my family, and occasionally going out for dinner. Now, while the full breakdown is a little bit more intense, let's say that it approximately came to about 2,000 to 2,500 euros per month. Knowing that amount then allowed me to reassess my situation, because at the time I was making approximately 3,750 euros per month. But that was, for me, work 40 plus overtime, so more like 50 to 60 hours a month. If 2,000 euros was my number, and I calculated it through, then I could get that number by working 24 hours. So, consequently, I could get my desired amount all the while getting back 20 hours a week. And I actually ended up setting up that deal for about 2 months before eventually quitting full-time to go all in on my podcast. And while the podcast doesn't bring in my desired amount just yet, please subscribe to help me get to it. I am about 75% of the way there, and I'm increasingly trying to work out ways to more effectively manage both my time and the money coming in. Constantly trying to work towards this rich life goal. So if you feel yourself transitioning into adult life and you constantly feel yourself saying, I wish if only I had the money, I would do whatever I want with my life, figure out what it is that the actual cost is of the thing that you want to do. Because having a financial goal will give you an understanding of something you want to work towards. And probably, if you calculate it through, it's not as expensive as you think that it is. Now, a quick plug, just in case you're struggling to figure out what it is that you actually want to do, and you, not what society does, but what you want to do, I recommend you watch my previous video titled Listen to Warren Buffett's Advice, in which I explain my 4-step system to figuring out what you want to do with your life. But that being said, those were my 3 lessons. Finally, if you've been following my progression over the last year, or if you've been following for a week, either way, I want to thank you for listening. I am honest to God the most happiest and fulfilled I have ever been, and I hope I can continue doing this for as long as possible. And that being said, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider smashing the subscribe button because it allows me to do more of the thing that I love. Otherwise, these were my 3 core lessons of transitioning from my core life crisis to adulthood. I hope it helps. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. And otherwise,